So the Abbé Dubos was elected to the Académie Française in 1720. That is, 1 year following the publication of his work, Critical Reflections on Poetry and Painting. It wasn't hugely surprising. The book had been a magnificent success. Yet, his integration to this formally conservative body does speak to the spirit of aesthetic revolution that was in the air. For by placing the proper perspective for critical judgment on the side of reception rather than creation, sensation rather than rule, spectators all over France and Europe were enfranchised on the same terms as the professionals to determine the value of a work of art or literature. Again, this does not mean that everyone's voice was equal, but rather that the starting place for good judgment was no longer to be found in Greek and Latin texts, accessible only to the smallest elite, but rather the seed of good judgment, feeling, could be found within every single person. Feeling, or one's heart, could for the first time potentially come to mean more in French civilization than one's social class. Thus began the era of emotion in France, or siècle de sensibilité. This shift was evident in every level of society and on every cultural surface. Eloquent speech began to focus less on delicate style than emphatic and energetic expression. Scenes of primitive, even savage love were woven into plays and courtroom pleadings, and conceptual language fell away as so-called natural expressions took center stage. The focus on nature, rather than rules and reason, as the primary source of all goodness and intelligence, manifested itself all over France. Perhaps one of the best examples can be found, somewhat surprisingly, at Versailles. Although, as we saw last week, the castle and main grounds of Versailles were the very height of the neoclassical focus on geometrical rules and supernatural symbolism, if you go through the parks of the castle and head north, you will come upon an expression of this new focus on the primitive and the natural in Marie-Antoinette's Hamlet, or Hamlet. In a complete turnaround from the way Louis XIV had governed through performance and public display, Marie-Antoinette's Hamlet was where she spent her time to get away from the pressures of public life. No one could follow her there without her express consent, and the design of her Hamlet provides just as stark a contrast with the gardens of Versailles. And just as her royal protocol differed greatly from that of Louis XIV, so too the design of her Hamlet provides just as stark a contrast with the gardens of Versailles. Here we find a paradise of faux rusticity, with Arcadian elements reminding us more of the more typical English garden. A tumble-down dairy, a picturesque dovecote, a shabby barn, and a tiny mill dot the perimeter of an irregular pond. Each building was decorated with its own little garden or orchard, as though to sustain its inhabitants. But it was all just show. It had no real function. The Hamlet, or Hamlet, was composed of dreamy objects placed here and there to transport its residents to a state of pre-civilization, where, so the thinking went, all men were good, and the evil forces of society had not yet taken root. This thinking was best encapsulated in the work of the Genevan philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau came to Paris as a young man, but his Swiss beginnings left an indelible mark. Unlike Lully, who generally sought to portray himself as the paragon of Frenchness, Rousseau treasured his status as outsider, always signing his letters Citoyen de Genève, or Citizen of Geneva, thereby making the point that in France everyone was subjects, while in Geneva there were citizens. Before they became bitter enemies, he was a great friend of the French philosopher Denis Diderot. The two were just young men starting out as writers when a plan was hatched. In 1750, The Academy of Dijon had just announced its yearly essay contest. The early modern period loved essay contests. And the question posed by the Academy was the following: whether the establishment of the arts and sciences had improved morality. Now remember, this was the century of progress. So many scientific discoveries had been made, treatises written, prejudices discarded, everything seemed to be moving in the right direction. The essay question was thus a bit of a fishing expedition. The Académie was really asking to see who could write the best song of praise. Well, Rousseau had heard about the essay and was planning a piece that would glorify the arts and sciences and their contribution to morality. But Diderot, whom Rousseau was visiting that day during his stay in jail for an obscene publication, was alleged to have suggested to Rousseau, why not flip the argument around? Why not argue the negative side just for a laugh? And that is just what Rousseau did. He wrote a very eloquent piece arguing that the sciences and the arts had in fact corrupted man's natural goodness and straightforward expression. The speech was entitled A Discourse on the Moral Effects of the Arts and Sciences, published 1750. And it was the definitive moment that changed public opinion for good in France and the Western world generally. Rousseau dedicated himself hitherto to the reconversion of people toward a natural way of being. Scientific learning and social hierarchy were anathema to his system. Of course, as an aside, Rousseau was only able to write this speech and have the career he did due to his education, and also given his constant self-fashioning as the lone individual in the world who was the only one who truly understood it. I think his denigration of social hierarchies generally was a little bit suspect. No matter, though, the 18th century loved Rousseau, no matter how much he claimed to despise them. Marie-Antoinette was soon frolicking around, dressed as a milkmaid in her fake Hamlet, which was one of many Hamlets that popped up at this time on the otherwise well-manicured properties of the French upper class. We should be careful, however, not to characterize her as simply silly or frivolous, caught up in a world of make-believe. For Marie-Antoinette and for her fellow Frenchmen, there was a pedagogical value in such a setting and lifestyle. If nature was the source of human goodness, then a natural setting and a natural lifestyle could potentially bring one closer to goodness. This would be Louis XIV's dystopian nightmare, but it was here that Marie-Antoinette thought her son would be best raised, in the fresh air, away from the artifice of the castle and its courtiers, and near the cows. Funny enough, I think many of us would have a tendency to agree with her on this point today. But in fact, this is the legacy of Rousseau. Away from Versailles, in Paris, this same aesthetic shift was taking place on the stage. With his play Le Père de Famille, or The Family Father, Denis Diderot had invented the drame bourgeois, or bourgeois drama. Contrary to the comedies and tragedies of classical playwriting, which figured princes and princesses to the exclusion of the common people, Diderot's plays put common folk on stage. The titles of his plays speak to this. Typical titles were usually the name of a famous person, a king or a queen. But here, he just used the conditions of people, like the father of the family. Another would be called le fils naturel, or natural son. And at this time, natural son meant illegitimate son. Instead of focusing on glory or magnificent downfalls, Diderot's plays sought to evoke the emotion of a spectator through an emphasis on gesture and pantomime. He theorized that it was not necessary for a character to express their sadness in 16 lines of rhyming verse, but should rather hold their head in their hands, give a gasp, and collapse to the floor. Such notions are commonplace to us today, but they were invented here, midway through the 18th century, in response to the revolution in taste begun by the Abbé Dubos.